Europe and beyond. We have seen what happens when countries slide into authoritarianism, slowly crushing the basic freedoms and rights of their citizens. We have seen what happens when corrupt oligarchies rob their nations of the wealth, resources, and human capital that are so vital to unlocking a brighter future for their citizens. We have seen what happens when the natural patriotism, which is a cornerstone of a healthy society, is warped into aggressive nationalism, exploiting fear and uncertainty to promote identity politics at home and belligerent confrontation abroad, while breaking rules and undermining institutions. And we see this when states like Russia flagrantly breach international norms, from the seizing of sovereign territory to the reckless use of chemical weapons on the streets of Britain by agents of the Russian GRU. We have to show there is a better way to meet the concerns of our people. That way lies in global cooperation between strong and accountable states, based on open economies and inclusive societies. That ensures strong nation states provide the bonds that bring citizens together and ensures power remains accountable to those it is there to serve. That celebrates free markets and has the confidence to reform them when they need to work better. And that demonstrates that delivering for your citizens at home does not have to be at the expense of global cooperation and the values, rules, and ideals that underpin this. Indeed, cooperation and competition are not mutually exclusive. Only global cooperation based on a set of agreed rules can ensure competition is fair and does not succumb to protectionism, with its certain path to lost jobs and international confrontation. And it is only global cooperation which can harness legitimate self-interest towards common goals, producing agreements on global challenges such as climate change, proliferation, and increasing inclusive economic growth. We see this cooperation here today at this UN, as we also saw it at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting earlier this year. And here today, as Chair in Office of the Commonwealth, I deliver a clear statement on behalf of the Heads of Government of its 53 equal and independent member states. We reaffirm our shared commitment to work together within a rules-based international system to address shared global challenges and foster a fairer, more secure, more sustainable, and more prosperous future. This commitment takes account of the special requirements of least developed countries and of small and otherwise vulnerable economies, and it benefits all our citizens and the wider world. But it is not enough for us merely to make the case for cooperation. We need action at home and in the community of nations to show how our ideas and values can deliver practical benefits for all our people in all parts of the world. We must recognise the legitimacy of people's concerns and act to build a global economy that works for everyone. We must invest in the patient work of building open societies in which everyone has a stake in the future. And we must act to uphold the international rules-based system and stand up for our values by protecting those who may suffer when it is violated. Let me take each in turn. First, we must respond to those who feel that the global economy is not working for them. The pace of globalization that has left too many people behind. The fear that our children and grandchildren may lack the education and skills to secure the jobs of tomorrow. And the risk that technological change could become a source of inequality and division rather than the greatest opportunity in history. In the UK, we are driving investment in industries of the future to create new jobs, from low-carbon technologies to artificial intelligence. We are investing in education and skills so that workers are ready to make the most of the opportunities that lie ahead. And we are making sure people play by the rules, so that business and innovation is celebrated for creating jobs, not demonized because of grievances over tax not paid or rights not respected. And while we strive to make our own economies work for all our people, we should do the same at a global level. In an increasingly global economy, it is not enough to ensure people play by the rules at home. We need global cooperation to set and enforce fair rules on trade, tax, and the sharing of data. and these rules need to keep pace with the changing nature of trade and technology. So we need to give the World Trade Organization a broad, ambitious and urgent mandate to reform. This must address the areas where it is not functioning effectively, deal with issues that are not currently covered, and maintain trust in a system which is critical to preventing a return to the failed protectionism of the past. Fair and respected rules are essential for business to flourish and drive growth. But recent history shows that this cannot be sustained without deeper partnerships between governments, business, international financial institutions, and civil society to ensure that growth delivers for everyone. That is why I recently visited Africa along with British businesses to promote trade and investment and encourage a new partnership based on shared prosperity and shared security. It is why at this General Assembly, I co-hosted an event with Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Kagame, and President Akufo-Addo, calling for more support for investment and job creation for young people in the continent. It is why the United Kingdom will maintain our commitment to spend 0.7% of gross national income on official development assistance. And we will put our development budget at the heart of our international agenda and do more to create jobs, improve skills, and increase investment in emerging economies in both our interests and theirs. For the best way of resisting protectionism is to ensure that this century is defined by open markets that really deliver for all our people. Second, we must build countries, not only economies, that work for everyone, inclusive societies where every citizen has a stake in the future. These are the firm foundations on which strong and accountable nations are built, and history has consistently taught us that giving people a stake in society is the best way to ensure stability, security, and economic growth. There is no one right way to do this. Every country must choose its own path, but the basic tenets are common across the world. They include a government that is transparent and accountable, an independent judiciary to enforce the rule of law, free and fair elections, and a free and open media, the freedom of expression, a right to redress, and property rights that are reliably enforced, and equality, freedom of thought, opinion, religion, and conscience, all found in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed 70 years ago. Those of us who believe in these tenets must set an example in defending and strengthening them at home and abroad. That is why we must call out hate speech, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of prejudice and discrimination against minorities, wherever we find it. Like many leaders, I suspect I do not always enjoy reading what the media in my country writes about me, but I will defend their right to say it. For the independence of our media is one of my country's greatest achievements, and it is the bedrock of our democracy. So too will I defend objectivity and impartiality in the face of those who treat truth as just another opinion to be manipulated. This challenge has only become more complex with the rise in social media and online information. That is why we agreed at the G7 summit in June to step up our efforts to respond to disinformation, and why, together with our partners and with tech companies, we are leading efforts to reclaim the internet from terrorists and others who would do us harm. And just as we must stand up for the values that we adhere to, so we must support countries and leaders who choose to take the often difficult steps towards a more inclusive society. The United Kingdom will use all the levers at our disposal to do so. Through our aid budget and commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, we will not only protect the most vulnerable, but also bolster states under threat and help others sustain their progress. Through global campaigns, we will help countries to end scourges such as modern slavery and sexual violence in conflict. And we will mobilise wider support through our alliances and membership of multilateral organisations, not only the UN, but also international financial institutions, the G7, the G20 and NATO. And just as there is no single recipe for an inclusive society, so there is no single model for balancing the democratic demands of our public with the imperative to cooperate internationally. The vote by the British people to leave the European Union was not a rejection of multilateralism or international cooperation. It was a clear demand for decisions and accountability to lie closer to home. I believe the role of leadership in these circumstances is clear. It is delivering on the democratic wishes of our people and international cooperation, working with allies and partners in pursuit of our shared values. Third, we must have the will and confidence to act when the fundamental rules that we live by are broken. This is not about repeating the mistakes of the past by trying to impose democracy on other countries through regime change. But we should not allow those mistakes to prevent us from protecting people in the face of the worst violations of human rights and human dignity. We should not allow those mistakes to paralyse the international community when its long-established norms are violated. And we should not let our inability to prevent some of the worst conflicts today stop us from making every effort to ensure they do not happen again in the future. For if we stand back, we allow the world to become divided into spheres of influence in which the powerful dominate the weak, and in which legitimate grievances go unaddressed. This is not just a moral imperative, it is also a matter of self-interest. For when barbarous acts and aggression go unchecked, dictators and terrorists are emboldened. So we must have the confidence to act. When the Syrian regime used chemical weapons on its people again in April, it was Britain, together with France and America, who took military action to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. And when earlier this year Russia used a toxic nerve agent in a sickening attack on the streets of Salisbury, the UK, with our NATO, EU and other allies, took action, expelling over 150 Russian intelligence officers, the largest collective expulsion ever. In Burma, following the damning report of the United Nations fact-finding mission, we should sow the same confidence to hold accountable those responsible for the appalling atrocities repeatedly inflicted by the Burmese military on the Rohingya, Shan and Kachin peoples since 2011. Similarly, we should gather evidence of Daesh's crimes worldwide, ensuring justice for their victims and deterring those who might conduct such crimes in the future. But accountability alone is not enough. We must do more collectively to prevent such atrocities in the first place and address the causes of instability that can give rise to them. The United Nations has a critical role to play, and it has a wide range of levers to do so, from sanctions, which show the leaders of Iran and North Korea that they cannot act without consequence, to peacekeeping missions such as that in South Sudan, which is helping to prevent suffering and the collapse of law and order. But to be able to draw effectively on these levers, the Security Council must find the political will to act in our collective interest. The UN's agencies must deliver the reforms that the Secretary-General has started to become more agile, more transparent and better coordinated on the ground. And to support these reforms, we must also ensure proper funding is targeted specifically at those parts of the UN that deliver results. 70 years ago, the General Assembly agreed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today, we must renew the ideals and values on which that declaration was founded. In doing so, we must learn the lessons of the past and show through our actions how cooperation between strong and accountable states with open economies and inclusive societies can best deliver security and prosperity for all our people. As Kofi Annan said at the start of his second term as Secretary-General, I have sought to turn an unflinching eye to the failures of our recent past in order to assess more clearly what it will take for us to succeed in the future. In that spirit, let us show unflinching resolve to renew the promise of freedom, opportunity and fairness, a promise which has delivered for more people in more places than at any other period in our history. And let us ensure that promise can be fulfilled for our children and grandchildren and for every generation to come. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank Her Excellency Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated, and I ask the protocol to accompany Her Excellency.
سوف تستمع الجمعية العامة.
The General Assembly will listen to the statement by His Excellency Nicolas Maduro Moros, President of the Bolivarian State of Venezuela. I ask the protocol to escort His Excellency to the podium.
باسم الجمعية العامة.
On behalf of the General Assembly, we would like to welcome in the United Nations His Excellency Nicolas Maduro Moros, President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And
نواصل الآن المناقشة العامة.
I have great pleasure in welcoming the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Her Excellency the Right Honourable Margaret Thatcher, and I invite her to address the General Assembly.
Mr. President, it gives me great pleasure to return to the podium of this Assembly. When I last spoke here 4 years ago, on the 40th anniversary of the United Nations, the message that I and others like me gave was one of encouragement to the organization to play the great role allotted to it. Of all the challenges faced by the world community in those 4 years, one has grown clearer than any other in both urgency and importance. I refer to the threat to our global environment. I shall take the opportunity of addressing the General Assembly to speak on that subject alone. During his historic voyage through the South Seas on the Beagle, Charles Darwin landed one November morning in 1835 on the shore of western Tahiti. After breakfast, he climbed...
I have great pleasure in welcoming the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Her Excellency the Right Honourable Margaret Thatcher, and I invite her to address the General Assembly.
Mr. President, it gives me great pleasure to return to the podium of this Assembly. When I last spoke here 4 years ago, on the 40th anniversary of the United Nations, the message that I and others like me gave was one of encouragement to the organization to play the great role allotted to it. Of all the challenges faced by the world community in those 4 years, one has grown clearer than any other in both urgency and importance. I refer to the threat to our global environment. I shall take the opportunity of addressing the General Assembly to speak on that subject alone. During his historic voyage through the South Seas on the Beagle, Charles Darwin landed one November morning in 1835 on the shore of western Tahiti. After breakfast, he climbed a nearby hill to find a vantage point to survey the surrounding Pacific. The sight seemed to him like a framed engraving, with blue sky, blue lagoon, and white breakers crashing against encircling coral reef. As he looked out from that hillside, he began to form his theory of the evolution of coral. 154 years after Darwin's visit to Tahiti, we have added little to what he discovered then. What if Charles Darwin had been able not just to climb a foothill, but to soar through the heavens in one of the orbiting space shuttles, what would he have learned as he surveyed our planet from that altitude, from a moon's eye view of that strange and beautiful anomaly in our solar system that is the Earth? Of course, we have learned much detail about our environment as we have looked back at it from space. But nothing has made a more profound impact on us than these two facts. First, as a British scientist, Fred Hoyle, wrote long before space travel was a reality. He said, "Once a photograph of the Earth taken from the outside is available, a new idea as powerful as any other in history will be let loose." That powerful idea is the recognition of our shared inheritance on this planet. We know more clearly than ever before that we carry common burdens, face common problems, and must respond with common action. And second, as we travel through space, as we pass one dead planet after another, we look back on our Earth, a speck of life in an infinite void. It is life itself, incomparably precious, that distinguishes us from the other planets. It is life itself, human life, the innumerable species of our planet, that we wantonly destroy. It is life itself that we must battle to preserve. For over 40 years, that has been the main task of this United Nations, to bring peace where there was war, comfort where there was misery, life where there was death. The struggle hasn't always been successful. There have been years of failure. But recent events have brought the promise of a new dawn, of new hope. Relations between the Western nations and the Soviet Union and her allies, long frozen in suspicion and hostility, have begun to thaw. In Europe this year, freedom has been on the march. In Southern Africa, Namibia, and Angola, the United Nations has succeeded in holding out better prospects for an end to war and for the beginning of prosperity. And in Southeast Asia, too, we can dare to hope for the restoration of peace after decades of fighting. While the conventional political dangers, the threat of global annihilation, the fact of regional war, appear to be receding, we have all recently become aware of another insidious danger. It is as menacing in its way as those more accustomed perils with which international diplomacy has concerned itself for centuries. It is the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, to the oceans, to Earth itself. Of course, major changes in the Earth's climate and environment have taken place in earlier centuries when the world's population was a fraction of its present size. The causes are to be found in nature itself, changes in the Earth's orbit, changes in the amount of radiation given off by the sun, the consequential effects on the plankton in the ocean, and in volcanic processes. All these we can observe, and some we may be able to predict, but we don't have the power to prevent or control them. What we are now doing to the world, by degrading the land surfaces, by polluting the waters, and by adding greenhouse gases to the air at an unprecedented rate, all this is new in the experience of the Earth. It is mankind and his activities which are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. We can find examples in the past. Indeed, we may well conclude that it was the silting up of the river Euphrates which drove man out of the Garden of Eden. We also have the example of the tragedy of Easter Island, where people arrived by boat to find a primeval forest. In time, the population increased to over 9,000 souls, and the demand placed upon the environment resulted in its eventual destruction as people cut down the trees. This in turn led to warfare over the scarce remaining resources, and the population crashed to a few hundred people without even enough wood to make boats to escape. The difference now is in the scale of the damage we are doing. We are seeing a vast increase in the amount of carbon dioxide reaching the atmosphere. The annual increase is 3 billion tons, and half the carbon emitted since the Industrial Revolution still remains in the atmosphere. At the same time as this is happening, we are seeing the destruction on a vast scale of tropical forests, which are uniquely able to remove carbon dioxide from the air. Every year, an area of forest equal to the whole surface of the United Kingdom is destroyed. At present rates of clearance, we shall by the year 2000 have removed 65% of forests in the humid tropical zones. The consequences of this become clearer when one remembers that tropical forests fix more than 10 times as much carbon as do forests in the temperate zones. We now know, too, that great damage is being done to the ozone layer by the production of halons and chlorofluorocarbons. But at least we have recognized that reducing and eventually stopping the emission of CFCs is one positive thing we can do about the menacing accumulation of greenhouse gases. It is, of course, true that none of us would be here but for the greenhouse effect. It gives us the moist atmosphere which sustains life on Earth. We need the greenhouse effect, but only in the right proportions. More than anything, our environment is threatened by the sheer numbers of people and the plants and animals which go with them. When I was born, the world's population was some 2 billion people. My grandson will grow up in a world of more than 6 billion people. Put in its bluntest form, the main threat to our environment is more and more people and their activities, the land they cultivate ever more intensively, the forests they cut down and burn, the mountainsides they lay bare, the fossil fuels they burn, the rivers and the seas they pollute. The result is that change in future is likely to be more fundamental and more widespread than anything we have known hitherto. Change to the sea around us, change to the atmosphere above, leading in turn to change in the world's climate, which could alter the way we live in the most fundamental way of all. That prospect is a new factor in human affairs. It's comparable in its implications to the discovery of how to split the atom. Indeed, its results could be even more far-reaching. We're constantly learning more about these changes affecting our environment, and scientists from the Polar Institute in Cambridge and the British Antarctic Survey have been at the leading edge of research in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, warning us of the greater dangers that lie ahead. Let me quote from a letter that I received only 2 weeks ago from a British scientist on board a ship in the Antarctic Ocean. He wrote, "In the polar regions today, we are seeing what may be early signs of man-induced climatic change. Data coming in from Halley Bay and from instruments aboard the ship on which I am sailing show that we are entering a spring ozone depletion, which is as deep as, if not deeper, than the depletion in the worst year to date. It completely reverses the recovery observed in 1988. The lowest recording aboard this ship is only 150 Dobson units for ozone total content during September, compared with 300 for the same season in a normal year. That, of course, is a very severe depletion. He also reports on a significant thinning of the sea ice. And he writes that in the Antarctic, he says, our data confirm that the first-year ice, which forms the bulk of sea ice cover, is remarkably thin, and so is probably unable to sustain significant atmospheric warming without melting. Sea ice, he continues, separates the ocean from the atmosphere over an area of more than 30 million square kilometers. It reflects most of the solar radiation falling on it, helping to cool the Earth's surface. If this area were reduced, the warming of Earth would be accelerated due to the extra absorption of radiation by the ocean. The lesson of these polar processes, he goes on, is that an environmental or climatic change produced by man may take on a self-sustaining or runaway quality and may be irreversible. That is from the scientists who are doing work on the ship that is present considering these matters. These are sobering indications of what may happen, and they led my correspondent to put forward the interesting idea of a World Polar Watch, amongst other initiatives, which will observe the world's climate system and allow us to understand how it works. We also have new scientific evidence from an entirely different area, the tropical forests. Through their capacity to evaporate vast volumes of water vapor and of gases and particles which assist the formation of clouds, the forests serve to keep their regions cool and moist by weaving a sunshade of white reflecting clouds and by bringing the rain that sustains them. A recent study by our British Meteorological Office on the Amazon rainforest shows that large-scale deforestation may reduce rainfall and thus affect the climate directly. Past experience shows us that without trees, there is no rain, and without rain, there are no trees. Mr. President, the evidence is there. The damage is being done. What do we, the international community, do about it? In some areas, the action required is primarily for individual nations or groups of nations to take. I'm thinking, for example, of action to deal with the pollution of rivers. And many of us now see the fish back in rivers from which they had disappeared. I'm thinking of action to improve agricultural methods, good husbandry which plows back nourishment to the soil, rather than the cut and burn, which has damaged and degraded so much land in some parts of the world. And I'm thinking of the use of nuclear power, which despite the attitude of so-called Greens, is the most environmentally safe form of energy. But the problem of global climate change is one that affects us all, and action will only be effective if it's taken at the international level. It's no good squabbling over who is responsible or who should pay. Whole areas of our planet could be subject to drought and starvation if the pattern of rains and monsoons were to change as a result of the destruction of forests and the accumulation of greenhouse gases. We have to look forward, not backward. We shall only succeed in dealing with the problems through a vast international cooperative effort. Before we act, we need the best possible scientific assessment. Otherwise, we risk making matters worse. We must use science to cast a light ahead so that we can move step by step in the right direction. The United Kingdom has agreed to take on the task of coordinating such an assessment within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an assessment which will be available to everyone by the time of the Second World Climate Conference next year. But that will take us only so far. The report will not be able to tell us where the hurricanes will be striking, who will be flooded, or how often and severe the droughts will be. Yet we'll need to know these things if we are to adapt to future climate change. And that means we must expand our capacity to model and predict climate change. We can test our skills and methods by seeing whether they would have successfully predicted past climate change for which historical records exist. Britain has some of the leading experts in this field, and I'm pleased to be able to tell you that the United Kingdom will be establishing a new centre for the prediction of climate change, which will lead the effort to improve our prophetic capacity. It will also provide the advanced computing facilities that scientists need, and will be open to experts from all over the world, especially from the developing countries, who can come to the United Kingdom and contribute to this vital work. But as well as the science, we need to get the economics right. That means, first, we must have continued economic growth in order to generate the wealth required to pay for the protection of the environment. But it must be growth which doesn't plunder the planet today and leave our children to deal with the consequences tomorrow. And second, we must resist the simplistic tendency to blame modern multinational industry for the damage which is being done to the environment. Far from being the villains, it is on them that we rely to do the research and find the solutions. It's industry which will develop safe alternative chemicals for refrigerators and air conditioning. It's industry which will devise biodegradable plastics. It's industry which will find the means to treat pollutants and make nuclear waste safe. And many companies, as you know, already have massive research programs. The multinationals have to take the long view. There'll be no profit or satisfaction for anyone if pollution continues to destroy our planet. As people's consciousness of environmental needs rises, they're turning increasingly to ozone-friendly and other environmentally safe products. The market itself acts as a corrective. The new products sell, and those which caused environmental damage are disappearing from our shelves. And by making these new products widely available, industry will make it possible for developing countries to avoid many of the mistakes which we older industrialized countries have made. We should always remember that free markets are a means to an end. They would defeat their object if, by their output, they did more damage to the quality of life through pollution than the well-being they achieve by the production of goods and services. On the basis, then, of sound science and sound economics, we need to build a strong framework for international action. It's not new institutions that we need. Rather, we need to strengthen and improve those which already exist. In particular, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme. The United Kingdom has recently more than doubled its contribution to UNEP, and we urge others who have not done so and who can afford it to do the same. And the central organs of the United Nations, like this General Assembly, must also be seized of a problem which reaches into virtually all aspects of their work and will do so still more in the future. The most pressing task which faces us at the international level is to negotiate a framework convention on climate change, a sort of good conduct guide for all nations. Fortunately, we have a model in the action already taken to protect the ozone layer. The Vienna Convention in 1985 and the Montreal Protocol in 1987 established landmarks in international law. They aim to prevent, rather than just cure, a global environmental problem. I believe we should aim to have a convention on global climate change ready by the time the World Conference on Environment and Development meets in 1992. That will be among the most important conferences the United Nations has ever held. I hope that we shall all accept a responsibility to meet this timetable. The 1992 conference is indeed already being discussed among many countries in many places. And I draw particular attention to the very valuable discussion that members of the Commonwealth had under the Prime Minister of Malaysia's chairmanship at our recent Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Kuala Lumpur. But a framework isn't enough. It will need to be filled out with specific undertakings or protocols in diplomatic language on the different aspects of climate change. These protocols must be binding, and there must be effective regimes to supervise and monitor their application. Otherwise, those nations which accept and abide by environmental agreements, thus adding to their industrial costs, will lose out competitively to those who do not. The negotiation of some of these protocols will undoubtedly be difficult, and no issue will be more contentious than the need to control emissions of carbon dioxide, the major contributor, apart from water vapor, to the greenhouse effect. We can't just do nothing, but the measures we take must be based on sound scientific analysis of the effect of the different gases and the ways in which these can be reduced. In the past, there's been a tendency to solve one problem at the expense of making others worse. The United Kingdom therefore proposes that we prolong the role of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change after it submits its report next year, so that it can provide an authoritative scientific base for the negotiation of this and other protocols. We can then agree to targets to reduce the greenhouse gases and how much individual countries should contribute to their achievement. We think it important that this should be done in a way which enables all our economies to continue to grow and develop. The challenge for our negotiators on matters like this is as great as for any disarmament treaty. The Intergovernmental Panel's work must remain on target, and we must not allow ourselves to be diverted into fruitless and divisive arguments. Time is too short for that. Before leaving the area where international action is needed, I would make a plea for a further global convention, one to serve and to conserve the infinite variety of species of plant and animal life which inhabit our planet. The tropical forests contain a half of the species in the world, so their disappearance is doubly damaging. And it is astonishing but true that our civilization, whose imagination has reached the boundaries of the universe, doesn't know to within a factor of 10 how many species the Earth supports. What we do know is that we're losing them at a reckless rate, between 3 and 50 each day on some estimates, species which could perhaps be helping us to advance the frontiers of medical science. We should act together to conserve this precious heritage. Every nation will need to make its contribution to the world effort. So I want to tell you how Britain intends to contribute, either by improving our own national performance in protecting the environment, or through the help that we give to others. And I shall tell you under 4 headings. First, we shall be introducing over the coming months a comprehensive system of pollution control to deal with all kinds